Okay, this week we're going to cover a new topic, which is political violence and insurgency in Latin America. And we're basically tackling the context within which the guerrilla warfare emerged and the consequences of this armed struggle and rising violence, and how and what are the main factors that actually generally would lead to a peace settlement between antagonistic forces, and the challenges after the ratification or signing the peace deal or the peace agreement between different combatants. So we're basically going to cover Salvador and Guatemala and Colombia. And we will touch upon rising insurgency in Mexico and the context of the one dominant party system in Mexico, within which Zapatistas or the insurgency people emerged in the mid-90s, and to what extent they changed the discourse of participatory democracy, and whether or not this kind of political action would be part and parcel of civil society organizations. We're going to look into or investigate the discourse of the Zapatistas and what kind of political and economic and social elements they stressed in order to emphasize a new role of local networks, or to give new definition to participatory democracy. So let's start with the context and the consequences and the challenges of the protracted civil wars in the three countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Colombia. And hopefully we're going to cover like El Salvador and Guatemala and part of Colombia today. And next lecture, we're going to continue with Colombia, and we will touch upon Zapatistas in Mexico. Back to week 2, when we mentioned something about historical institutionalism, and we covered mainly James Mahoney article about path dependence, explanations of regime change in Central America, and how the antecedent conditions and the critical juncture of the elite divisions, or the division between conservative and liberals that ushered in a new reform period led by the liberal factions or the liberal elites. And they actually they had like this kind of disagreements over the privatization and the scale and the scope of the privatization of communal and public lands, in order just to get integrated into the global market and to increase the productivity of the coffee sector. That they had like some sort of comparative advantage in these sectors. We covered actually the article covered Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Costa Rica, and tried to explain what factors led to different political trajectories, with a reinstatement of traditional authoritarianism in Honduras and Nicaragua, and military authoritarianism in Guatemala and El Salvador, and then the establishment of political democratic politics and continuity of political democratic politics in Costa Rica. Quick reminder about this radical implementation of liberal economic reforms, or this liberal reform period, that led to the expansion of the commercial, agricultural, and the incorporation into the global market. And this gave rise to new economic elites that occupied the power centers, that almost like in all countries except for Honduras and Guatemala, that actually the privatization and the economic reform measures didn't give way to new economic elites that occupied political positions or effective government positions there. But what happened in Guatemala and Salvador was quite remarkable, because it gave way to new political, new economic elites that they had stake in political process and political dynamics, and they occupied, they monopolized actually the power centers, and in order to protect their economic and vital interests as well. And this like coincided with the emergence of new administrative apparatuses, or the centralization of the political administration in order to penetrate different areas in their societies. And this actually obliged or compelled political elites in order to establish coercive military apparatuses in order to actually to crack down and to deal with the rising tension in the rural areas, with the emergence of the rural mobilization. So with the critical juncture, with this intensification of the liberal reform measures, with like expansion of the commercialization of the agricultural sector and the expansion of agricultural exports, especially in bananas and coffee sectors, this like gave way to pro-democracy and mobilization from below, and this gave way to rural mobilizations or heightened social polarization, class polarization, especially in rural areas. Unlike Costa Rica, that this happened in Guatemala and El Salvador. With the legacy of the liberal reform period that carried over into or extended into the next 7 decades, they had like a strong and coercive military apparatus. So they had the coercive capacity in order to quell and suppress these pro-democracy movements, and to brutally put an end to pro-democracy movement, or the political mobilization of the campesinos, joined by students and workers. So with this, the emergence of political mobilization and the coercive capacity of the state or the military, so this created, as Mahani mentioned, that was like critical juncture that eventually led to path-dependent kind of regime type, that which was authoritarian, military authoritarian regimes. But it didn't end there, because the guerrilla, the insurgents actually continued, and the spiral of of violence actually continued on, and this led to like prolonged civil wars in both countries. That perhaps this would usher in a new period of or a new critical juncture that led to transformation of some sort of economic changes, and transformation of social structures, and transformation of the perception of the dominant ruling elites and dominant economic interests. And this eventually led to armistice agreements and peace deal, in order to establish or to make to push the countries, or to pull these countries to democratic transition pathways. So that actually what happened in Guatemala and Salvador, and it was like much more complicated in Colombia, as we are going to see, because of the multiplicity of the people engaged and the political economy of violence there. So let's start out with El Salvador. So what was the context within which the guerrilla warfare actually emerged and continue its military and violent operations? So as I mentioned, it was like a closed political system, and the polity was totally closed to outsiders. And they had like this tight military agrarian elite alliance that gave no room for any defection, any elite defection, or any reformist faction to emerge and to push through different reform programs. So with this solid military agrarian elites alliance, that like the agrarian elites, that the concentrated ownership in these like few numbers of families that dominated the coffee sector, they formed, the socioeconomic foundation for the military regime there. So this actually led to or fit into this exclusionary nature of the political economy of export agriculture. So they had like a vested interest in closing off the polity, not to broaden, the socioeconomic foundation or coalition of the regime, and this alliance was quite tight and solid, too solid to enable any other elites or any other elite faction to emerge or to break away from this kind of formulation. So, except for brief periods within the context of the Second World War and after the end of the Second World War, that enabled some political parties to emerge, and another brief period in the mid-60s, especially with the introduction of or enabling, or establishing this proportional representation system that allowed many political parties to contest and to in elections and to compete over some legislative seats at the national and local levels. So, except for these periods, the political landscape was totally closed, and the political dynamics actually excluded other sectors, and like wide segments in society were totally underrepresented and were totally excluded from the political dynamics. So that actually the political landscape was controlled by National Conciliation Party. And with enabling this proportional representation system and this electoral reform in the mid-60s, this gave way to the Christian Democrats to form their parties that played important role in the 70s with the emergence of the Civil War. So with this like exclusion from political processes and no institutionalized channels for disaffected or underrepresented populations in order to articulate their demands through these channels. So they resorted to these political mobilizations in order to articulate their cumulative grievances and to ask for more political and social reforms. So like these pro-democracy movements with the peasants or campesinos mobilization in rural areas, and then like joined by students and workers, that they asked for more social and political reforms as well. This actually led to some sort of defection within the army with the emergence of the reformist faction in 1979. But given the fact that it's a closed political system, this reformist faction was quickly disposed, with the predominant position of the hardliners and this exclusionary nature of the political economy, that they had like these economic predominant economic elites that they dominated, the like different power centers. So they actually managed to marginalize reformist faction and to reinstate their political position or dominant political position, and this actually led to like more repressive turn, like with like continuing political mobilization from below, and with this like brief period of elite defection. So the state had to crack down on the protesters and to even exclude these opposing factions. With this indiscriminate nature of violence and deploying these kind of repressive measures, this triggered moral outrage at this nature of violence and state repression, and this increased, the popular support for guerrilla warfare that started to take roots, especially in rural areas amongst the peasants. And as I mentioned before, in week 2, Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front. So Farabundo started to actually to gather, you know, different guerrilla groups that they eventually fused into this front. And it appealed to wide masses they actually became disillusioned with the existing, you know, political establishment on the one hand, and they had like rising anger at the political elites because of their repressive measures. But during the course of the war, so with Farabundo gaining some control over lands and some rural areas, and they established their support base there, during the course of the war, so what happened, it was like total or was like a remarkable and considerable reshaping of class structure in El Salvador that had long-term implications for elite perception and the effective economic interest of landed elites and the predominant economic elites there. So with gaining some ground in rural areas, Farabundo imposed war taxes that, like landed elites, they had to make some sort of payment in order to have their control over lands, and in addition to these kind of violence, increasing, you know, violence during the course of the war, and this kind of taxes, the imposition of war taxes, globally, what happened, it was like a decline in the global prices, especially of coffee sector, and this. Like alongside the violence of Farabundo that actually pushed landed elites to leave their lands. So they had to diversify their economic base, and they shifted away from agricultural sector or export agriculture to commercial sector, for example. And like this kind of shift in export agriculture and this kind of shift of or diversification of the economic basis went in tandem with some sort of political liberalization measures. The global and the global context there was like the civil war, the Cold War, and this kind of tension between the East and West blocks. So the United States had to support the military establishment or the military regimes in order to quell and to counterweight and offset, you know, the rising power of the guerrilla or the communist and the leftist forces. So in order to transfer some military aids and funds to the military regimes, actually the United States, the American administrations forced the ruling elites in El Salvador in order to undertake some political liberalization measures. So with these, like with the help of the United States, the Christian Democratic parties, the Christian Democratic Party and forces, they agreed, you know, with the junta and with the support of the United States to have like elections that brought Duarte in power. With this alliance, so they had to implement or they had to conform to some political liberalization procedures or electoral procedures. So the Christian Democratic Party or the government, it was like Duarte was like the first president, non-military candidate to assume office in El Salvador. So it was like a remarkable turning point in the political history in El Salvador in the early 80s. And they had to undertake some economic reform measures that was called like counterinsurgency reforms that led to that seized some assets and led to more like shift in the property rights in El Salvador. So counterinsurgency reforms and rising violence of Farabundo or guerrilla groups, this led to change in the perception of economic interest of the predominant or the previously predominant economic elites, and led to like restructuring of the social and economic relations between different forces. Elizabeth Wood actually conducted field work there, and from using like the words of some landlords in El Salvador and some from like business people, how they reflected on the changing economic structure there. So they had like one of them mentioned something about he had to sell, you know, the land. It has been a nightmare trying to work it or to rent it, the land. And if we want to work the property, the Farabundo occupied the property and are not going to let us. So that it precluded, you know, the operation or the continuity of the economic activities in rural areas. So that's why they had to, it led to displacement of business elites or landed elites from their properties. And another reflection on the changing structure there from business people there. So one mentioned something about the structure of the capital has changed, and the big capitalists have left agriculture. So this like exclusionary and closed nature of the political economy of agricultural sector, or the export agricultural sector, especially in the coffee sector, it was like totally shifted during the course of the Civil War. So they have left the countryside broken up by agrarian reform. The counterinsurgency reform actually led to more confiscation of assets or asset seizure. So that's why they had to leave their lands. There are still some in agro industry and exporting in coffee mills and cotton gins. Medium capitalists have also changed their way of thinking and of investing quite a bit. They are diversifying as they recapitalize the country. So it led to like this structural transformation and change in economic relations and economic diversification. It changed like the perception of their economic interest, and whether or not they have an interest in perpetuating. They don't drive any benefits. They don't reap any gains and profits from the Civil War. On the contrary, it actually affected them negatively, affected their business enterprises negatively, that they got displaced from the property because of the counter-insurgency reforms implemented by the government, or like the violent act of Farabundo there that actually precluded their economic operations or economic activities there. One like crucial element in the process of the Civil War, it was like the right-wingers. So now the United States played important role in supporting the government, and the government had to comply with some sort of conditions. It had to confirm to these American conditionality of implementing political liberalization and complying with this electoral contestation. So that's why the right-wingers and the hardliners, they formed their own political party, that they no longer depended on only on the military in order to make their operation against, or to implement their military operation against Farabundo or against the guerrilla groups. So they formed their own party that it was like this had like long-term ramifications and implications for the political dynamics there in El Salvador. So they actually established their National Republican Alliance Arena Party in order to contest in the elections and to implement their military operations that actually notoriously known for the death squads with the support of what they called Miami groups, like people, Salvadoran that actually lived outside. So they transferred money to the hardliners with these remittances, with these kind of constant supply, constant funds from people abroad. And so they actually formed this Miami group within Arena in order to implement their military operation to purge or to have like their operation against insurgents. But again, by forming or establishing their political party and playing with the electoral rules of the game, it had unintended consequences. Because of the United States pressures for liberalization, this led to detachment, or this led to like dissociate, these hardliners from the military establishment. So they had to appeal to wide masses in order to contest in the elections. They had to reach beyond this narrowly based coffee cultivators in order to attract supporters and to build their base of support. So like playing, with these electoral or within these electoral rules, this eventually eroded, the solid basis or the weakened, the political basis of the hardliners inside arena, and this paved the way for another moderate factions to take over. And actually, one of the prominent figure, like politician that actually led or pushed for these hardline policies, Dao he had to give up. He formed, this like faction of hardliners, and he had to abide by the same electoral rules. So he had to go through, these kind of nomination processes, but with the pressure of the United States and some other pressures from within the Arena party. Actually, he was forced out, or he had to give up on electoral nomination in the early 80s. And this enabled another faction led by a Cristiani faction that actually became president in 1985. That they had stake in, or they had interest in terminating or putting an end to the civil war there. And this like facilitated the installation or dissemination of the new norms and aspiration in El Salvador by abiding or conforming to these electoral contestation and marginalizing or neutralizing, the hardliners that actually their political and social basis actually eroded because of the pressures of the United States and the emergence of new moderate faction or moderate sector within the rightist party, the National Republican Alliance. So this paved the way, like gradually, to negotiated settlements with the Farabundo or with the insurgents, and these like negotiated settlements and agreements culminated into the signing peace deal in 1992. So the main prominent or the key features of these settlements, it did like great job with incorporating or including previously guerrilla or groups or Farabundo into the political dynamics that effectively transformed itself from guerrilla group to political party to abide by that actually abided by or complied to the rules of the game. So it became like less it created like an environment that became less dependent on violence in order to achieve some political goals. And it led to like some sort of political reconfiguration of the coercive apparatuses of the state and rapid demobilization of different insurgents or different guerrilla groups in El Salvador. So with this kind of electoral contestation, with the integration or incorporation of the leftist forces into the political processes and reshaping the institutional setting or undertaking meaningful and significant institutional reforms, this helped actually different antagonistic forces to get to the negotiation table and to have like this peace agreement to be ratified by the main players or the combatants. So actually, it created like a national office for like defense of human rights. That was like one of the key demands of guerrilla groups that actually defended they had to they asked for transitional justice procedures in order to get to the negotiation table and in order to ratify these peace agreements. So actually, this led to the establishment of the supervisory council or body over elections in order to make sure that all political parties have fair representation in the political process, and these the key elements of these peace agreements later actually codified into legal frameworks or some sort of constitutional amendments. So this actually enabled or created or established more autonomy of the executive branch, and the established actually the autonomy or strengthened the autonomy of the National Judicial Council in order to guarantee the integrity of the adjudicating process and to have a political implementation or effective implementation of the peace agreements. One key feature of any peace settlement or peace agreement after the end of the Civil War, it included restructuring the military and restructuring the police apparatuses. So because of during the course of the Civil War, some special units actually were created, and some special forces were deployed in conflict areas. So these special units and unprofessional actually police forces had to get dismantled in order to enable the creation of a more professional national police force. And this actually coincided with the creation of the new police academy in order to train officers or policemen into or in more professional, in order to create more professionalized national police forces. And part of the transitional justice procedures as well is the creation of truth committees in order to investigate the violation of human rights committed and atrocities committed during the Civil War. So this actually, according to the peace agreement, the parties agreed on creating or establishing ad hoc truth commissions that eventually led to the purification or purged the military of the ranks that actually committed human rights violations during the Civil War. This is a common theme as well in peace agreements or having a ceasefire agreement or a peace deal between different antagonistic forces, the reluctance in the very beginning in order to implement or to put this into force. So it was reluctance in the beginning in order to dismantle, these special units, in order to, especially the militias or the special military units and the treasury police. But eventually and gradually, the peace agreements or the key elements actually were implemented, and this led to the gradual incorporation of insurgents into the political dynamics and into the political processes over the course of the 90s. So one of the key, one of the main privileges or advances of these peace agreements in El Salvador, that democracy, they enabled actually democracy to nourish or to emerge in highly unlikely place. Unlike Latin American cases, as when we talked about the third wave democratization, it was in the almost in the vast majority or almost in all the countries, it was the process of re-democratization. Most of the countries, they had legacy of democratic politics, and this the bureaucratic, the installation of military regimes or bureaucratic or authoritarian regimes actually put an end to these populist politics or democratic politics. And with the third wave of democratization cascading like the region, it actually enabled the return of democracy. It was like a process of re-democratization rather than installing or establishing democratic institutions from scratch. And El Salvador it was like quite different because it was like it didn't have the country, as I mentioned. It was like the political structure and the admission to the polity was totally actually closed and dominated and controlled by the National Conciliation Party, and with except for brief periods of political liberalization or political opening, the total dynamics actually was. The political processes actually were limited to this tight and solid alliance between the military junta and the landed elites, agrarian elites. So with these kind of making this dual transition from war to peace and from authoritarianism to democracy or open electoral democracies, this actually depoliticized the role of the military. It actually restructured the civil-military relations with these processes of purifications, purging the military of the ranks or the officers that actually committed violations against human rights violations during the course of the Civil War. This actually depoliticized the role of the military and restructured the relationship between the civilians and the military establishment. So actually, it gave, like, according to peace settlements and peace agreements there, it didn't give any kind of political role to the military. So there is no kind of legitimate reason to get engaged or involved in the political dynamics. And it did like great job as well. The peace agreement led to the integration of the leftist forces into the political process. As I mentioned, Farabundo got engaged and included into the political and transformed itself into a political party to contest in the elections. And over the course of the 90s, the front or the Farabundo actually managed to contest or to compete over legislative seats and emerged as the most powerful political party and political force that actually competed fiercely with the Arena Party. And eventually, Funes, like previous member of the Farabundo insurgency groups, he actually made his way to the presidency. He actually was voted into office in 2009, and Arena peacefully handed over power to the FMLN party candidate. So this actually led to peaceful transfer or alternation of power there, and these kind of process of habituation and political learning these processes were quite remarkable in El Salvador, that eventually trained all political actors and all political forces in democratic norms and these routinization of these democratic practices, that they developed these democratic norms and democratic aspirations over the course of democratic transition. But there are some setbacks as well when it comes to the legacies and the social legacies of the civil wars. Like any country that witnessed like prolonged civil war, so the population or the peoples actually got accustomed to these forms of political and social violence. So this kind of social habituation to violence was one of the important obstacles like political elites had to deal with in order to pave the way or to restore the stability and political order. And you can like follow like the homicide rate and public lynching of like if people actually were skeptical about criminals. So this led to like direct or assault on suspected criminals. So they were kind of accustomed to, they got used to this, and they were kind of, they had to develop like, they had to get adjusted to new realities and to get adjusted to new social and cultural norms. And that was like one of the main obstacles to instill, you know, this kind of democratic culture and to put an end to this social habituation to violence. And this kind of rapid demobilization of the insurgents or the guerrilla groups that they had like to agree on like these demobilization and laying down arms, and institutional restructuring as well, like the military establishment by purging, you know, the establishment of some officers and dismantling some police units, and creating a new police academy in order to professionalize the national police forces. That was like a rapid process that actually made, you know, swift turn to new realities that it took like some time to all political actors and all political forces to get accustomed to. And as it was the case in other Latin American countries, they had like, again, like these social and economic problems as well. So this kind of economic, this kind of democratic transition went hand in tandem with like this neoliberal implementation of a neoliberal economic model or market-oriented policies that actually added one layer of complexity there that they had, like the state had to carry out some policies in order to ensure the social welfare of the citizens, schooling, healthcare, transportation, etc. And especially in rural areas where guerrilla groups, they had their own local organizations and local networks that they offered some services, and they offered some that advanced, you know, the economic livelihood of peasants there. So with the increasing, you know, economic pressures and social problems, this added like one more obstacle to consolidate, you know, these the democratic transition, or to consolidate these democratic institutions. But again, like this, like a strong insurgents, like Farabundo front, and the strong insurgents and this political stalemate, the political impasse between like the ruling elites or the state and insurgents, this pushed, you know, both parties to the negotiation table and to have like an agreement to terms of peace and ceasefire. But and because of this balance of forces between like the two combatants or the main two antagonistic forces, this led to the restructuring of some of the state apparatuses, and most notably the military and the police forces. But it didn't happen. It didn't follow, like Guatemala that didn't like follow the same path. Because actually what happened in Guatemala, it didn't witness any kind of displacement of agrarian elites or property elites from their property, like the counterinsurgency reform and the violent attacks and the violent presence of Farabundo in the rural areas led to like a shift in the this property structure and the diversification of the economic basis of the dominant economic elites. This led to like a shift in their actual and perceived perception of economic interest. In Guatemala, there is no kind of displacement back then, and no kind of agrarian reform carried out by the government. And what happened there was like the balance of power between insurgents and the government actually was like asymmetrical. Like it was like considered as a decisive defeat of insurgents. So that's why the military and the ruling elites, they didn't find any reason to offer concessions or to compromise or to have like to offer more for insurgents in order to get to the negotiation table. So they didn't have any kind of bargaining leverage. So that's why they perhaps asked for more, but eventually, ultimately, they got little or less than what they asked for. So with this unalterable social and class structure or elite structure there in Guatemala, and the insurgents' defeat there, these kind of the processes of political habituation and political learning, these processes were sharply circumscribed there, and this led to protracted negotiation path between the state and the insurgents that eventually led to the ratification of the peace deal in 1996 and codified into constitutional reforms in 1997. So the context within which guerrilla groups actually emerged and escalated their military operation and violence, the process started with some implementation of extensive social and economic reforms with Arevalo 1944-1951. Like the implementation of enabling or promulgating social security code that offered more rights to or guaranteed labor rights, but some workers were eliminated. That was not like comprehensive social security reform. Some elements actually were excluded, but Arbenz in 1951, he actually complemented and implemented these far-reaching or extensive land reform measures in order to offer more inclusionary social reform policies. But as we mentioned in week 2, when we discussed Crowley chapter, with this, it was like a textbook case of military the military intervention on the part of from the United States, with the CIA operation orchestrating, these kind of military invasion, and made its way into Guatemala in order to dispose or to unseat the communist regime there. So it was like a commonplace, military intervention or the American intervention in Latin American countries during the Cold War in order to unseat elected communist or leftist governments there. So this again led to the eruption or the outbreak of large-scale violence in Guatemala, and people started to guerrilla groups started to mobilize and to recruit peasants in rural areas, and to actually invest in this class struggle and class polarization there. And this triggered counteraction from the state that actually cracked down on guerrilla groups and deployed formed some special units, and in order to make sure that they implemented this brutal repressive policies. And this continued on until the mid 80s, and the massacring villagers, especially in Mayan indigenous people, it became a commonplace, and this actually heightened or led to the emergence of identity politics there, and it became one of the central political theme in Guatemala. It started during the Civil War, and actually it continued on after the end of the Civil War. So with these critical juncture of implementation of the liberal reforms and privatization of private lands that led to reactive sequence period with the emergence of political mobilization and harsh crackdown from the state, and in order to suppress the emerging social forces. This enabled guerrilla groups to recruit more supporters, especially in rural areas, with the help of the Catholic Church and some progressive faction in the Catholic Church. And this enabled them to sustain some guerrilla actions and military operations in rural areas. But with some sort of changes in the regional and international context in the 1991, so what happened was like the end of the Cold War and the changing orientation of the United States administrations towards this democracy promotion, and put an end to this military intervention in Latin America as its backyard and sphere of influence. So what happened in 1991, it was like Sandinistas as well losing elections in Nicaragua, combatants and antagonistic forces in El Salvador concluding now their peace settlements and peace deal in El Salvador, the end of the Cold War. So these kind of changes in international and regional contexts pushed political elites in Guatemala in order to depoliticize or to decrease, the political role of the military. So now there's no reason for the military to intervene in politics, and this actually paved the way to electoral dynamics, or to enable elections to take roots in Guatemala. So the process actually fostered or got intensified with Serrano, who tried to undertake an executive coup, but the military refused to intervene in order to support the coup, or to support the executive. So this actually and deferred this to the legislative means or the institutional means to resolve these elite disputes in order to proceed with the political reforms. And this actually was laid the groundwork or put an end to this unusual or unconventional means of transfer of power, in order to enable elections to resolve elite disputes and to have to socialize and to train political players into electoral competitions, and how to conform to the electoral results or electoral outcomes in order to implement their policy programs. So within this context, political elites had to negotiate and to reach peace agreement and peace deal with the guerrilla that now fused into one particular unit, or one coherent unit, Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unit. So actually, over the course of protracted negotiations over concessions, because as I mentioned, the military and the political elites, the dominant, ruling elites, they didn't see any logic in offering any sort of political concessions to insurgents, because in the battlefield, they were actually defeated. But eventually they had these peace accords, and that got codified into constitutional reforms. And according to these reforms, these reforms were comparing to what happened in El Salvador, they were they didn't trigger, or they didn't result in some sort of institutional restructuring as it happened in El Salvador. So what happened was, according to these peace agreements, this led to the offered some space for the UN verification mission in order to document violations and to monitor some political practices. And again, part and parcel of any peace agreement after the end of the Cold War, after the end of the Civil War, they had to agree on measures of transitional justice. So they had to establish these truth commissions in order to penalize or to punish those who actually committed human rights violations during the war. But actually these commissions, the functions of these commissions actually were largely undermined by granting amnesty to some politicians or offering elite impunity in Guatemala that actually enabled some of the political elites who committed violations and got involved in what was called dirty war in Guatemala. They actually contested in elections and presided over some political agencies or like Congress, for example. So they enabled like the same political figures that actually committed or got involved in some violations during the civil war to practice their political rights after the end of the civil war and the ratification of the peace accords. So when it comes to the main responsibilities of the army, according to the peace agreements, the agreement limited the responsibilities of the army to preserving or defending territorial integrity against any external threats, but effectively it didn't lead to any purification or purging. Some purification within the ranks. So it actually defined its like limited its role to defending in territorial integrity and the sovereignty of the nation, but effectively the army continued to play important political role there. Again, like similarly, they had to create more or to establish more professionalized national police, national civilian police by dismantling civilian patrols and militia units that they actually deployed or created in rural areas in order to fight against insurgents or guerrilla groups in these areas. And unlike El Salvador, they had to ask for or to include, some elements regarding social and economic and agrarian issues in Guatemala in order to stipulate the main responsibilities, the social and economic responsibilities of the state in order to guarantee the social welfare of its citizens, or to invest in rural public, to carry out some public investment programs in order to carry out policies for rural developments and to guarantee more just social order and fair distribution of economic resources. As it happened in El Salvador, or like this is like a common obstacle or common problem after terminating civil war. It's a paradox of losing peace after winning war. So again, like this social habituation to violence, homicide rate, and like high crime rates and public lynching, the patterns of public lynching against suspects actually were very common in these countries, and it took like several years in order to improve the situation slightly. Elite impunity was one of the main challenges because, as I mentioned, some of the politicians that actually involved or masterminded, some of the military operations during the civil war, they were allowed to contest in elections. Like Montt in 2003, he eventually had to give up and totally excluded. But after going through these litigation processes with the electoral tribunal and the constitutional court, but actually legally they had the right to practice their political rights. So that was like one of the important challenge towards like the quality or towards consolidating the nascent democratic institutions. Again, like building democratic constitutions totally unsupported by political culture, like elite mentality or elite elite, the mindset of the political elites and the masses were totally like detached from these democratic aspirations and democratic norms. And this actually, so unlike in El Salvador, like these kind of changes in economic relations and social structures or class structures there, with the creation of or transforming the militias or the guerrilla groups into effective political parties, and with the right-wingers actually during the war repositioned itself, the party Arena party repositioned itself towards more moderate positions. These electoral dynamics and the creation of political parties actually institutionalized the party system after the end of the Cold War, after the end of the Civil War. But what happened in Guatemala, it was quite different. With no political parties actually gained these kind of wide mass support to get congealed over time. So this led to non-institutionalized political parties, and this suffocated political space in Guatemala. It didn't actually help with the institutionalizing party system there. Like Mayan groups or indigenous groups, actually the accent, like indigenous people actually reaffirmed and reasserted their identity during the war, especially with the with committing massacres against these people. This accentuated this sense of belonging. So after actually they were identified with their language and their attachment to land, so they define themselves as Mayan people, and they formed their own movement, like pan Mayan movement, in order to heighten their ethnic and cultural identification, and this actually convoluted by conflicts over lands as well, and over land distribution as well, and even this triggered some sort of intra-ethnic violence between different groups within the indigenous people there. But the crucial element was the distribution of conflicts over land distribution, and how to ratify or to stipulate their identity and cultural autonomy rights in the constitution. And actually the peace accords enabled constitutional reforms to safeguard the rights of the indigenous people. But again, they had like some other issues with regard to the economic and social transformations and their material well-being. Like other Latin American countries, the implementation of neoliberal economic policies precluded or like imposed obstacles when it comes to the implementation of inclusionary or far-reaching distributive programs that had like social repercussions as well when it comes to the quality of democratic representation. When people asked for more and they didn't actually get what they asked for, so they actually got disenchanted with the political establishment or with the electoral dynamics, because no longer representative of their social and economic demands. The state actually managed to secure some revenues in order to invest in public investment programs or social welfare programs, but again, like with this budget constraints and the conditions of international institutions, the conditionality of the international financial institutions, it actually put limits on the government ability or the capacity to for social spending or to allocate more resources for social expenditure. So again, like we are going to tackle like the issue, the relationship between like development, social and economic development, and democracy next week. But this is like one of the main challenge or toward like consolidating the emerging, the newly emerging democratic regime or democratic institutions in Guatemala. Okay, so I'll leave it off. So I leave it there, and next time we're going to go into some detail with regard to the civil wars and political consequences in Colombia, and as like separate focus on insurgency in Mexico and what kind of discourse Zapatista actually articulated, and the effect on calling into question, the PRI's monopoly over power, and what kind of discourse of participatory democracy their local networks or civil society organizations actually offer there. It would be like a standalone explanation or investigation of insurgency actions in Latin America in a different context. Okay, so that's all for today, and see you next time. Bye.